August 1944. Aboard the USS Barb, somewhere beneath the churning cobalt waters of the East China Sea. The air inside the control room hung heavy, a dense, metallic mixture of stale sweat, diesel fumes, and the sharp tang of ozone from the batteries. Above them, Japanese destroyers conducted their methodical depth-charge dance, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump vibrating through the Barb's hull like a gigantic, slow heartbeat. It was a sound Commander Eugene Fluckey had grown to love, a siren song of danger that meant he was close enough to strike. Fluckey, his face set in an expression of intense, almost predatory calm, watched the attack plot. His uniform, a simple, stained khaki shirt, was soaked across the shoulders, not from the heat of the tropics, but from sheer concentration. Fluckey was not just another submarine commander. He was an apex predator in a steel tube, and Barb was his custom-built weapon. Already, they had carved a reputation of almost mythic proportions, pioneering tactics that terrified the Imperial Japanese Navy. Just weeks earlier, in a daring nighttime surface attack, Fluckey had plunged the Barb into a convoy of 12 ships, sinking 4 of them in less than an hour. He favored surface attacks, believing the speed and maneuverability of the sub on the surface gave him the edge. Attack, attack, attack was his mantra, and his crew, a collection of hardened, professional mariners, lived by it. They were the Bremerton Barbarians, and their reputation was built on audacious aggression. Now Barb was heading home to Pearl Harbor after another devastating patrol, but Fluckey's ambition was far from sated. He was already planning the next, and it would be a patrol unlike any other. He wasn't content to simply hunt merchant ships and escort destroyers. He was aiming for the very heart of the Japanese Empire, the home islands. The Japanese had protected their inner waters for years, believing the nets, mines, and air patrols made the area impenetrable to American submarines. Fluckey intended to prove them wrong. His target was Karafuto, the southern tip of Sakhalin Island, and the heavily trafficked sea lanes along the Japanese coast. But the mission Fluckey began to formulate in the stale, pressurized silence of the control room was more audacious than any torpedo run. He wanted to hit the Japanese where they felt safest, on land. As Barb slipped past the nets and through the minefields of the Japanese coast, Fluckey gathered his officers. The patrol had been successful, but Fluckey, leaning over a navigational chart in the tiny wardroom, pointed not to a shipping lane, but to a slender black line running along the coast. A railway. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice quiet but commanding, "we've sunk everything that floats. Now we're going to sink something that runs on rails." The initial reaction was a mixture of stunned silence and nervous excitement. A submarine sinking a train? The concept was absurd, yet terrifyingly real under Fluckey's leadership. It would require landing a demolition team on the Japanese mainland, a ground combat operation launched from a submarine, deep within the enemy's home territory. It was unprecedented, and in the highly disciplined world of the Silent Service, it was pure, calculated anarchy. Fluckey's eyes swept over the faces of his men, searching for the right combination of skill, nerve, and creativity. He knew the traditional Navy would balk at the idea, but his men, the Bremerton Barbarians, simply wanted to know one thing: how? This wasn't a job for just any sailor. This required a certain kind of ingenuity, a capability for unconventional problem-solving that standard military training didn't necessarily instill. Fluckey needed men who could adapt, who could improvise under extreme pressure. He needed men who had been prepared for emergencies since childhood. He decided Boy Scouts. He was looking for a specific kind of skill set, the ability to make do with what you had. The train was running, but they had to figure out how to stop it, and it wouldn't be with a torpedo. They would need explosives, sure, but more importantly, they needed a detonator that was invisible, foolproof, and completely tailored to the target: a fast-moving, heavy train. The idea was planted, and now the search began for the one man whose unconventional genius could turn Fluckey's impossible vision into a historical reality. Commander Fluckey wasted no time in making his intentions clear. When they surfaced that night, the submarine's dark silhouette blending into the misty backdrop of the Japanese coastline near the Shiranooka River, The atmosphere in the Barb's wardroom was electric. He stood before his crew, not behind a desk, but leaning against a torpedo tube hatch, treating the highly classified operation with the casual air of announcing a routine drill. The ground combat mission was officially named Operation Ricksha. "We are going ashore," Fluckey announced plainly. 8 men. Unmarried. Volunteers only. This is not mandatory. You will be launching a ground attack on the home islands, the first and likely the last of this war. The objective is to destroy the coastal railway line. The air filled with a chorus of excited whispers. Every man aboard Barb was a professional killer, but this was different. This was cloak and dagger work, a raid that sounded like it belonged in a pulp adventure novel, not a war patrol log. The unmarried clause instantly narrowed the field. Fluckey was determined to minimize the casualty impact should the worst occur. Then came the unusual stipulation. Half of the volunteers selected, Fluckey continued, his eyes twinkling slightly, must be former Boy Scouts. The crew exchanged bewildered glances. Boy Scouts? This was war, not a camping trip. Fluckey explained his reasoning simply, based on his own experience with the organization. Boy Scouts, he stated, are trained to be prepared. They know how to improvise, how to use available materials, and how to stay calm and resourceful in an emergency. They know knots, first aid, and crucially, they know how to think outside the box when the manual is useless. The selection process was swift and focused. 8 men were chosen, a mix of seasoned submariners, tough Navy men, and 4 resourceful former scouts. Among the latter was an engineman second class named Billy Hatfield. Hatfield wasn't the biggest or the most decorated man, but he possessed a quiet, intense ingenuity that Fluckey valued. His background was in mechanics, but his hands were as good with a wire splice as they were with a wrench. The problem, as Fluckey laid it out, was simple in concept but incredibly complex in execution. How do you blow up a train using a fuse that is reliable, safe for the placement team, and triggered only by the weight and speed of the train itself? Torpedoes were out. The train was on land. Standard demolition charges required a time fuse, which was dangerous and unreliable, or a manual trigger, which would leave the landing party exposed on the tracks when the train approached. What they needed was a pressure switch, an apparatus that could be placed under the rail and detonated by the tons of rolling steel passing over it. This is where Billy Hatfield, the former Boy Scout and current engineman, stepped forward. He didn't rely on standard Navy demolition doctrine. He thought back to his childhood on the farm. Growing up, he had seen and learned about the immense, crushing power of a locomotive. His idea wasn't based on military explosives training, but on a memory from his youth, a simple, elegant physics demonstration he'd heard about. How to crack the hardest nuts by placing them on the railroad tracks. Hatfield procured the necessary materials. 2 blocks of salvaged, highly potent tetrytol explosive, a small piece of wood, some fine copper wire, and, crucially, a microswitch. The microswitch, typically used for limit control in machinery, was small, sensitive, and designed for precise activation. His solution was a masterpiece of jury-rigged simplicity. He mounted the explosive charges on the ties outside the rails. Then he placed the microswitch on a wooden block and positioned the whole assembly directly underneath the rail. A light wire connected the switch to the blasting caps in the tetrytol. The theory was brilliant. The weight of the train applied vertically would depress the rail by mere millimeters, a movement imperceptible to the eye, but more than enough to activate the sensitive microswitch. The switch would close the circuit, sending the current from a small dry cell battery into the blasting caps, detonating the tetrytol and blowing the rail and the train skyward. It was a homemade, rail-activated detonator, a fuse born not of naval training, but of a Boy Scout's ingenuity and a farm boy's understanding of pure, devastating force. The stage was set for the impossible raid. The final plan was approved. 8 men, the Fluckey Commandos, would land on the coast of Karafuto near the village of Shibatori. The date was July 23, 1945. It was a clear, moonless night, perfect for clandestine operations. The Barb surfaced just 950 yards offshore, close enough that the rhythmic clack-clack of a distant Japanese train could be heard faintly on the deck, yet far enough to remain hidden in the low coastal fog. Commander Fluckey personally oversaw the launch. The 8 raiders, heavily armed with Thompson submachine guns, Colt .45 pistols, and pockets full of spare blasting caps, slipped silently into 2 rubber boats, their faces darkened with camouflage grease. Leading the team was Lieutenant Commander William Bill Taylor, a man known for his icy nerve. Engineman Billy Hatfield, the architect of the demolition device, carried the critical components, the blocks of tetritol, the microswitch device, and the dry cell battery, carefully secured in a waterproof canvas bag. The landing was executed with the precision of seasoned commandos. They paddled through the light surf, the rubber boats scraping against the gravel beach with only the softest sound. The air was cold, damp, and thick with the smell of pine and salt. Just beyond the beach, a dense growth of scrub forest provided immediate cover. The 8 men moved like shadows, their bootfalls muffled by the soft earth, their eyes constantly scanning the dark, tree-lined hills for any sign of Japanese sentries. The railway line, their objective, was less than a quarter-mile inland. It was a single track, heavy gauge, running parallel to the coast. The team reached it minutes later. The rails gleamed faintly in the dark, cold to the touch. The tracks were elevated slightly on a simple embankment, and the entire area felt silent and deserted, save for the hum of telegraph wires overhead. This silence, however, only amplified the tension. They knew they were deep behind enemy lines on the Japanese home islands, and that discovery meant instant, brutal combat against overwhelming odds. Taylor deployed half the team as perimeter security, setting up firing positions in the surrounding brush. The main demolition effort was handled by Hatfield and 3 other engineers. Hatfield immediately knelt between the ties, his focused attention blocking out the immense danger of the situation. He worked methodically, guided by the light of a heavily shielded, low-lumen flashlight. First, he identified the perfect spot, a section of track where the ties were sturdy and the rail was easily accessible. He carefully placed the 2 blocks of tetritol explosives, each wrapped in canvas, securely against the ties right outside the running rails. These were the punch. The real finesse lay in the trigger mechanism. Hatfield carefully slid the small wooden block containing the sensitive microswitch under the rail base. He adjusted its position by feel, ensuring that the switch's tiny lever was just barely touching the underside of the rail, ready to be depressed by the slightest downward pressure. He then meticulously connected the microswitch to the blasting caps embedded in the tetritol using fine copper wires. Finally, he connected the dry cell battery to the circuit, completing the ingenious homemade pressure switch. The circuit was now live, waiting for the train to become the final conductor. The setup took only 15 intense minutes. Hatfield concealed the small wires and the switch assembly with a thin layer of sand and small pebbles, leaving the track looking completely undisturbed. As the team retreated swiftly back toward the coast, they knew that their job was done. Now, all they could do was wait. The success of the entire, highly illegal and unprecedented mission rested on the precise, millimeter-level pressure of a heavy train wheel against a piece of childhood ingenuity. The 8 raiders moved silently back toward the beach, the mission's success hanging precariously on the nearly invisible device left under the rail. They had retreated far enough to be safe from shrapnel and close enough to their pickup point, the rubber boats waiting at the water's edge, but not so far that they couldn't witness the payoff of their terrifying night's work. Lieutenant Commander Taylor positioned the men in a low embankment overlooking the tracks, their ears straining in the pitch black for the sound that would signal either victory or a disastrous retreat. The minutes stretched into an agonizing half-hour. The coastal fog had thickened, dampening sound and reducing visibility to near zero. Suddenly, a new noise cut through the silence, a distant, low, rhythmic rumble, growing steadily louder. It was the sound of a heavy locomotive approaching, its steel wheels clicking over the track joints, a sound of routine industrial transport that was about to be violently interrupted. The Japanese train, likely a vital supply conveyance loaded with coal, timber, or possibly troops, was moving fast, completely unaware of the deadly trap awaiting it. As the engine drew closer, the noise intensified from a rumble to a roar, punctuated by the mechanical choo-choo of the powerful steam engine and the bright, blinding glare of its single headlight punching through the fog. For the men of the Barb, pressed into the cold, damp earth, this was the ultimate moment of truth. The massive weight of the locomotive, hundreds of tons of steel and pressure, roared over the exact spot where Engineman Hatfield's crude but genius device lay waiting. The split second the lead wheel truck of the engine passed over the microswitch, the track bowed down by a fraction of an inch. That minute of depression was enough. The microswitch clicked, closing the circuit. The dry cell battery instantly surged current into the blasting caps, which in turn triggered the 2 blocks of tetritol. The resulting explosion was cataclysmic. A brilliant, searing flash of white light momentarily annihilated the darkness, followed by a deafening, tearing crump. The ground beneath the commandos heaved violently. The explosion was perfectly positioned. It tore through the rail joint and blasted directly upwards. The track buckled, the ties splintered into matchsticks, and the massive steam locomotive immediately derailed. The noise of the detonation was instantly replaced by the horrific shriek of tearing metal and the high-pitched hiss of steam escaping a ruptured boiler. The lead engine didn't just stop, it was violently flipped onto its side, smashing into the embankment. The following freight cars, driven by their own kinetic energy, accordioned into the wreckage, piling up in a mountain of tangled steel, splintered wood, and scattered cargo. The momentum of the train ensured total devastation, turning the supply convoy into a smoking pyre of twisted wreckage. Hatfield's device had worked flawlessly. It was the only confirmed instance of a submarine sinking a train. The entire team watched the spectacle unfold, a testament to their audacity and the power of unconventional thinking. Lieutenant Commander Taylor didn't wait. The job was done, and they were now a ground force pinned deep behind enemy lines with an enormous, smoking advertisement of their presence. They sprinted for the beach, the sound of the burning wreckage and the faint, panicked cries of Japanese crewmen ringing in their ears. They left behind not a torpedo mark, but a crater and the smoking ruins of a train, proof that Commander Fluckey's Bremerton barbarians could strike anywhere, even on the mainland of Imperial Japan. The dash back to the coast was a blur of adrenaline and disciplined movement. The sudden immense explosion had certainly alerted every Japanese military unit within miles, and the raiders knew that search parties would soon swarm the area. Their primary objective now was speed and silence. They reached the beach where the 2 rubber boats lay waiting, pulled into the scrub brush exactly where they had been left. Taylor and the men immediately pushed the boats back into the surf. The paddling back to the USS Barb was fraught with anxiety. They were exposed, low in the water, and their dark forms offered little camouflage against the restless sea. Every man strained his eyes, expecting the flash of a searchlight or the incoming chatter of a machine gun from the shore. A few hundred yards offshore, the black, sleek silhouette of the Barb waited, Commander Fluckey standing on the bridge, scanning the water with high-powered binoculars. The moment the raiders' boats bumped against the hull, they were hauled aboard, gear first, then men. They scrambled down the conning tower hatch, their mission report delivered not in words, but in the grime, mud, and triumphant exhilaration etched onto their faces. Within 90 seconds of the last man entering, the loud, insistent clang of the dive alarm echoed through the hull. Barb performed a crash dive, disappearing beneath the waves just as the first distant, agitated sounds of Japanese patrol boats, drawn by the towering column of smoke rising from the destroyed train, began to reach the coast. They had pulled off the impossible raid and escaped the scene of the crime with mere minutes to spare. Below the surface, the Barb set a course away from the enemy coast. The control room erupted in cheers, muted only by the need for operational silence. Fluckey, calm as ever, smiled and looked at Engineman Billy Hatfield. Hatfield, who had based the success of the most unconventional mission of the war on an idea from his Boy Scout days, the practical knowledge that pressure equals power, was a hero. He hadn't just followed orders. He had solved a fundamental combat problem with sheer, grassroots ingenuity. The attack on the railway was more than just the destruction of one train. It was a profound psychological blow against the Japanese Imperial Command. It proved undeniably that American forces could strike at the very heart of the Japanese home islands, even engaging in ground combat. Operation Ricksha became legendary. Fluckey was later awarded the Medal of Honor for the patrol that included this audacious raid, and the entire 8-man landing party, including Hatfield, received the Silver Star. The legacy of the USS Barb was cemented by this act. They had sunk a train, the only submarine in history to ever achieve such a feat. It stands as the definitive example of the audacity and resourcefulness of the silent service during World War II, proving that sometimes the most effective weapon against a sophisticated military machine isn't a complex, purpose-built device, but the simple, prepared mind of an engineman who remembered his Boy Scout lessons. The Bremerton barbarians had not just sunk ships, they had, quite literally, brought the war to the enemy's doorstep and left their signature in the form of twisted track and a blown-up locomotive. The train was gone, but the story of the submarine that sank it would run forever.